Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another installment of our TPR Live. Thank you so much for showing up today and joining us. My name is Kelsey, and I'm going to be talking to you about the PSAT. So today is January 21st, and so that means if you've got a PSAT scheduled for January 26th, that's probably on your mind as well as your teachers. And I'd just love to know two things from everybody that's watching live today. Are you registered to take that January 26th PSAT? And question number two, have you showed up the past couple of Thursdays and watched what we've been doing here in the realm of prepping for the PSAT? Would really love to know if we've got a repeat audience or some brand new folks today, just so we can kind of cater, because that test is coming up soon. So I'll kind of hang on and wait for those responses to come in. But I do see that we've got a smaller group here today, which means that you'll definitely have an opportunity to get your questions answered, which is really what this is all about, right? With these standardized tests, they can feel very intimidating, not really sure what they're all about. Okay, we've got someone here taking the SAT thinking this might help prep. Well, you're totally right. And I actually want to pause and mention that there were some pretty big updates that came out from the College Board earlier this week. They are discontinuing the optional essay completely, so that's not going to be on the exam anymore for the official SAT. That essay was never on the PSAT to begin with. And they're also doing away with all their subject tests. So if you had been planning or thinking about applying to a school that would require you to take one of those additional subject tests, those are no longer going to be offered by the College Board going forward. So pretty big updates. Again, they're kind of pivoting and dealing with this pandemic situation the same way we all are. But if that's kind of where we're at, just wanted to get those updates out there. And we can go ahead and talk a little bit. We're going to talk about the PSAT a little bit, but what we're also going to cover is how many similarities there are between the PSAT and SAT. So everything I'm saying pretty much today can apply to both. It looks like we've got some new folks here. So welcome all. Thanks for coming. And we're going to go ahead and dive right in and get started here. And the first thing I want to just put out is probably in a year or two, or maybe less, no one here is going to really remember what your PSAT score was. I know I don't. You're probably not going to remember it within 6 months. And that's just because there's very little reason to be reminded of what it is. You're not going to have to put it down on any applications. And once you have your SAT or ACT score, it's just going to push that PSAT score so far out of your mind. The only reason it might stick is if you're a recipient of that National Merit Scholarship. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. So what's the point of the PSAT if you're never going to remember your score and you don't use it for anything, really? And that's just because essentially this is the launching point for your SAT or your ACT prep. Those are the tests that really are going to matter. So whether you already have your PSAT scores, if you took it this past October, or if you're gearing up to take it next week, basically once you have those PSAT scores, what do you do with them? Now what? So we're going to discuss how you can use the PSAT to begin prepping for those bigger tests and ultimately just improve your chances of getting into the college that you want to get into. My name is Kelsey. I'm an outreach specialist with the Princeton Review. I also teach and tutor for the SAT, the ACT, and some of those graduate exams, the GRE, and parts of the MCAT. I've been with the Princeton Review for a few years now, and I love helping people, tackle these standardized tests because they can feel very frustrating and very intimidating, and they come around, not that often in the grand scheme of things. So I really enjoy having the opportunity to speak with all of you today. The Princeton Review has been helping students to get into their dream college for over 35 years in a bunch of different ways. So I'm bringing all of that expertise to this presentation as well. We're going to cover three main ideas. And again, when I say PSAT, everything more or less parallels over to that SAT. There's a lot that they do have in common, but what these test scores mean for your future test prep. So first, we're going to talk about some truths and misconceptions, dispel some rumors that you may have heard about the PSAT. We'll talk about going forward from the PSAT up to the SAT or ACT, some of those bigger tests that are actually going to factor into your college applications. And we'll talk about creating a test prep timeline, talking about ways that you can actually really begin to prepare in earnest for those tests. So when we're done with our hour or so today, it'll probably be less than that, but we'll have time for questions. You'll have a really solid idea for how to begin your test preparation so you can get the score you want. So first off, we're going to talk about some truths and misconceptions and rumors about standardized testing in general. We're sure that you've heard plenty of them. Maybe that your PSAT perfectly predicts your SAT or that it determines where you can go to college. Maybe you've heard that certain schools have cutoff scores that students have to have, or if you're a certain type of student, you should expect. No, none of that. Let's take a step back and think about what these tests actually measure. So we're going to play true or false. Um, we are doing this because we see these wrong answers all the time, and I'm sure that you've heard them. So I want to make sure that you know that the answers are wrong here. So let's look up at this first one. Do standardized tests like the PSAT or the SAT or the ACT, do they measure your intelligence? Are they like an IQ test in some variety? What do we think about that first one? This is going to be a no, right? It doesn't measure your intelligence. How well you do, it doesn't have anything to do with how smart or how creative you are. All it tests is how well you take the PSAT. If you get a 1500, that means you're great at taking the PSAT. And if you get a lower score, that just means you're not so hot at taking the PSAT. It's just a test taking skills test. All standardized tests really have to be that way because they're given to students all over the world who have taken different classes, they've had different teachers, and they're used to compare students with different academic skills and interests. So just want to reiterate, this is not any sort of IQ test. How about the second one? Do they reflect your GPA in high school? This one's going to be a no. Um, got a little ahead of myself there. Sorry about that. Yeah, good. um, if you think about it this way, half of the PSAT is math, while math is only one class among many others in high school. So if you're not so great at math, you're probably going to do worse on the PSAT than in high school in general. But also your high school GPA is going to be based on a bunch of different things, your coursework, your essays, group projects, as well as tests. But the PSAT is just a test. But okay, this is really a college admission test, or at least the preliminary version if we're talking about the PSAT. So would a standardized test like this predict your college GPA? Is that what it's good for? This is also going to be, if you're sensing a pattern here, this is a no, right? Of course not. In fact, they do a worse job of predicting your college GPA than of reflecting your high school GPA. And that's because once you're in college, you'll be able to focus on things that you enjoy and that you're good at in your major. So you'll be able to do better in college than you did in high school, perhaps. You're also going to be taking fewer tests in college than you did in high school. So your test taking skills are going to be much less important. And so let's take a look at this last one here. Does the PSAT test what you've learned in high school? Is what you learned in high school going to be tested on the PSAT? And on this one, I mean, the jury's still a little bit out. A little bit, I guess so. Kind of depends, right? Those answers are sort of right. There will be things on the PSAT that you learned in high school, sure. Pythagorean theorem, basic grammar. But some of the things might be stuff that you learned well before high school. Content isn't what makes these standardized tests so hard. Instead, it's the fact that standardized tests are just completely different from your high school tests. Um, so your high school tests, they follow a certain pattern, right? They cover a limited subject matter, at most a year of a course, but most of the time just a few chapters. High school tests evaluates your content knowledge, how much you know about any given subject. So that's why you're given plenty of time to finish the exam and why your teachers often will want to give you partial credit or even sometimes extra credit. They can do that because high school tests are graded by humans. And the tests are usually just one element of an overall grade. And that's in stark contrast to standardized tests like the PSAT. They cover years of material and they jump around between grammar and reading and math and different topics within those subjects. And to succeed, it doesn't really matter what you know, but just if you can deal with the structure of a standardized test. And you've got to do it in a rigorously timed setting and make sure that you get the right answer, avoid all the wrong answers because it's graded by a machine that won't give you any partial credit. And if all that isn't stressful enough, your end score is going to be the only thing that matters. And so that's kind of why the PSAT and other standardized tests are so hard for so many students. You've been learning one way to take tests basically your entire life, and now you're being judged on something completely different. And it only makes it worse that these standardized tests are so important to college admissions. So let's take a detour and talk a little bit about why the PSAT is promoted as a scholarship test, even though very few students do actually qualify. Does anybody know what percent of students actually receive a National Merit Scholarship? I'll give you a hint, it's not a lot. It's actually less than half of 1%. So let's break down those numbers. First, about 1.6 million juniors across the country will take the PSAT. That's 1.6 million students being tested on the exact same thing the exact same way. And of those 1.6 million, only 1.5% of juniors taking the PSAT will receive national merit recognition. That's 50,000 students. Very few students earn this recognition, and that's not even the scholarship part. There are even fewer students who become semifinalists. Yeah, very close. Who become semifinalists, just 16,000, and then the finalists. Um, so only 7,500 students across America become National Merit Scholarship recipients. So even if you don't actually win the scholarship money, having the recognition of being within that category of top performing students is a really cool achievement. And that should be on your college applications. But if you don't, it's not going to hurt your admission chances anywhere. So that means we can think about the PSAT as just a plus, right? If you ace it, there's a scholarship on the table, there's this prestigious recognition. But if not, it's really no big deal. It's not going to hurt you at all. So that's important to keep in mind. Here's an example of what your score report from the College Board would look like. It gives a lot of information, but all you can really extrapolate from that is how you did on the PSAT. But you can see in detail how you performed on test day and use that to inform your preparation moving up towards the ACT and the SAT, the bigger tests, right? So the biggest, most obvious number, that's going to be your total score. So the student here got a 960. You can also see how you did on the reading and writing and math just below that. And it also shows you how you did against those other test takers. So this student got in the 51st percentile, meaning she's scored better than 51% of all students. Also notice it shows how you did against a benchmark of college readiness. This is a College Board measurement that is of uncertain derivation, not really sure how they're calculating it or what it means, so don't put too much stock in that. And at the very bottom, you can see your scores on the individual reading, writing, and math tests. And so in a way, that's kind of what matters. That's what's used to calculate for the National Merit Scholarship. It's not your PSAT score, this National Merit Scholar Selection Index. It's just a number that's used to determine if you qualify for the scholarship or not. And the way it's calculated is they add up your reading and your writing and language and your math test score. They add those three up and they multiply it by 2, and that's what this index is. Important to remember that this scholarship doesn't have a ton of money attached to it, but it is quite prestigious. So if you find yourself getting a pretty high score here as a sophomore, it might be worth the opportunity to really prepare to take the PSAT when you could possibly qualify it for it as a junior. But again, if it doesn't happen, no harm, no foul, never going to hurt you in any way in terms of actual college applications. And if there's any questions as we're going through, please feel free to get those in the chat and they'll come back to me. But let's just take a moment here and look at the PSAT scoring. PSAT and SAT content and scoring are very similar, but let's just take a look at how PSAT scores are different than the SAT scores. Um, the answer is that they're scored on a different scale. So the PSAT is scored on the same rubric, but on a slightly different scale as the real SAT. So the real SAT is scored from 400 to 1600. PSAT is scored from 320 to 1520. So although they're on slightly different scales, your total PSAT score is a direct indicator of your total SAT score. So a total PSAT score of 1,000, for example, that could mean that if you took the SAT on the exact same day, you would have gotten a total SAT score of 1,000. And that might be a little weird to think about, right? That you have a score that shows how you might have scored if you had taken a different test. Um, but if you think about what that 80-point difference on the high end means, the College Board is essentially saying that they expect students to improve by about 80 points from the time you take the PSAT to the time you take the SAT. Of course, that 80-point improvement isn't a guarantee, but it is likely that your score will go up in between the two tests. So let's take a look at this chart. And actually, we do have an update here, right? because that essay is going away for good. So let me go ahead and cross that off for y'all. All right. So we do not have the essay on the SAT anymore, but taking that away actually illustrates just how similar these two tests are. First, I want to point out that the content is exactly the same. It's covering the same material in the same order. So the only real differences are the PSAT is about 15 minutes and 15 questions shorter than the SAT, and that's it. So taking this test, particularly if you're taking it in school with your classmates, when the stakes are low as a sophomore, it's great practice for the SAT. You've basically already taken the whole test under timed conditions. And so that's why it can feel like such a natural thing to go from the PSAT to the SAT. So again, for most of you, PSAT score is not going to mean much to you in the long run. But if you've taken a test that's almost identical to the SAT by now, that kind of gets to the PSAT's real value. Provides a perfect opportunity to launch your SAT or ACT prep. So I keep saying SAT or ACT. Let's talk about their similarities because they've got a lot in common. The toughest parts of each test are shared between them. Um, you are going to have over 3 hours of testing time. So if you think about that, that's crazy. Nothing anybody ever does takes that long, really. Musicals have intermissions, football games have halftime. We don't get a halftime taking the SAT or the ACT, unfortunately, and they're not as much fun as either of those things. So you're probably going to be sitting in an uncomfortable desk chair staring at some test booklet, but it's not some boring slog because these tests have limited time per question. So you're going to feel the pressure to finish every minute because you need to be working through each question for the whole time you're testing. So you have to manage your time quite carefully on both the SAT and ACT in order to succeed. So these similarities between the two tests, that's not just stuff that makes the tests hard, but it can give you an advantage. Like the fact that they're mostly multiple choice tests. Multiple choice questions can be annoying. I get it. But they also give you a really particular advantage. If you have four choices, you might be able to get the right answer because you can spot the wrong answers. That's called process of elimination, and you're probably using it in some way anyway. And you can use that on any type of multiple choice question. Finally, they cover quite similar material. They both have a math section, of course. They cover high school math up through Algebra 2. There's a handful of trig questions in there as well. They also both have reading sections. Those are going to require you to read some advanced passages and answer complex questions about those passages. And then they also both have questions or sections that require you to fix the grammar and structure of passages. SAT calls that section writing and language. ACT calls it English, but they're pretty much the same thing. And finally, ACT seems to be pretty different from the SAT by having this dedicated science section. But the SAT reading section has sciencey passages in it that look a lot like ACT science. And so does the PSAT have circle theorems? Um, there will be like circle geometry, but you're not going to have any proofs or theorems kind of at that advanced level on the SAT or PSAT. Good question. But let me point out another difference here between the SAT and ACT. There's a formula sheet on SAT math. So you wouldn't have to memorize those kind of basic formulas of the circles and quadrilaterals and triangles. But on the ACT, there is no such thing. So you've got to have all those kind of locked down and ready to go. But whether you're up against the SAT or ACT or both, perhaps, you're going to have to sit there a long time. You're going to be stressed out over most questions, probably. But you can use similar strategies on both tests, and it's good to remember that they do cover quite similar material. And another way that they're really similar and work the same way as the PSAT, in fact, is the test writers are just trying to trick you. So you need to kind of approach all these questions a little bit suspiciously. If it looks too good to be true, it probably is. So let's read this math problem and think about what they're trying to get you to do, how they're trying to trick you. If a store raises the price of an item by 20%, then decreases the new price by 15%, what is the percent change of the price in the item? If you're trying to finish this fast and looking to cut corners, maybe save time, maybe if you're thinking a little bit too quickly about this, there's a pretty easy mistake to be made here, right? What is that? Just to say 20 minus 15, that's 5%. Boom, that's it. But let's make sure that's actually the right answer because I'm approaching this test very suspiciously, and I know that the test writers are out to trick me. So we don't know how much this thing costs. Let's say it costs $100 because that's going to make dealing with percentages pretty easy. So if something that costs $100 is raised by 20%, what's our new price there? It's going to be 120, right? And then if we're decreasing the new price by 15%, so 120 minus 15% of 120, that's $18. So 120 minus 18 is $102. So that's just a 2% increase, right? But you know for sure that that 5% increase would be one of those multiple choice answers. Yeah. So always be careful, always be suspicious. It's very unlikely that you're going to have a question on the PSAT or the SAT or the ACT where you can just glance at it, you know, do a quick subtraction in your head and have the right answer. There's probably going to be something trickier in there. So you got to have your guard up and be suspicious as you go through. And that's unfortunately why most of the common mistakes that will cause students to miss questions are really simple. You know, you're not likely to get a question wrong because you can't remember the quadratic equation or if the vocabulary is really obscure and difficult, but it's more likely that you're going to do a few small things to mess up. You may answer questions too quickly, like we did in that previous math question. You may put down something careless. You know, you may not notice the difference between a semicolon and a colon in the grammar section, even though you know those rules. You might also make mistakes by doing work in your head. There's going to be a lot of distractions on test day, most likely. You might have somebody next to you tapping their pencil, shuffling papers, something's beeping somewhere. All that stuff can cause you to kind of mess up if you're keeping too much in your head. Oh, do we want to go back to the question here? We can totally do that. Was there something, oops, we can see it kind of worked out a little bit more. I can do this off to the side here. So if we are saying that it costs $100, and we can say that because we don't know, and then we increase that by 20%, presumably we'd have our calculator for this question. So if we add 20% onto $100, our new price is going to be 120. And then what's the next thing this word problem is asking us to do with that? We're decreasing the new price by 15%. So to get that, we could multiply this by 0.15. And 120 times 0.15 is going to give us 18. So if we're subtracting 120 minus 18, that's actually going to give us a difference or a new price essentially of $102. So the percent increase in the price wouldn't be the 5% that we thought right off the bat, but it would be a difference of going from $100 to $102. Does that answer your question? It's tricky, right? You know, it looks like it should be much easier than it is, but when you get into the weeds, it's quite sneaky. All right, let's go back here again. You know, very easy to make some common mistakes on this exam. You don't want to carry too much stuff in your head, and you can also, you know, misread the problem. You may, you know, expect to see the word increase instead of decrease. Or you might miss the word not somewhere. If you're moving too fast, it's easy to just misread the problem and go off in search of the wrong answer completely. Or another possibility is that you might just not understand what to do. And I don't mean you're not going to know the rule or you're going to forget the math formula, but you're going to have trouble untangling the specific task that the question is requiring you to do. And so these are just some of the reasons why it's hard to get a perfect score on these tests. In fact, for a lot of students, it's hard to get a high score. And it's even more difficult if you don't understand what a good score or what your target score should be. Was there any formula to use? Not on that question. Nope, you just had to know how to deal with percents. Mhm. And so for some of us, that could be stuff that we learned a while ago and might need some refreshing before we take this test. So let's look at the scoring pretty quickly. So they might seem to be scored on completely different scales, but To understand these, you just need to understand percentiles, in fact. So when you get your score report from either the SAT or the ACT, it'll tell you what your percentile score is. And so what that means is that your score is going to be better than that percent of all test takers. So the 50th percentile means that your score is better than 50% of test takers. It also means it's going to be the average score. So not every student in high school plans on going to college. Not every student takes these tests. So the averages are about a 1040 on the SAT and a 20 on the ACT. Um, but even more important than knowing what those averages are is knowing how percentiles work. So they're kind of designed to push everybody into scoring into the middle. So even if you're a strong student and a strong test taker, you probably can't expect to just get every question right. So if we think about, what percentage of students get a perfect score on any one section, it's extremely small. It's just 0.1%. So 99.9th percentile. So both tests are having students score closer and closer to those middle points. Just 1% of students will score above a 1500 or a 34. 10% of students score above a 1340 or a 29. 25% score above a 1200 or a 25. Um, and the 25th percentile is down at a 9, 10, and a 16. So if you think about, how the percentages are really working here, half the students are going to score between a 9, 10, and a 1200, or between a 16 and a 25. That's where most students are scoring. So let's get into this. You're probably thinking, what score should I try to get? What's a good score? And so, what do you think? What number do you think is going to be a good score for you? A 1370 or a 1400 on the SAT, or 26 or 31 or 35 on the ACT? Um, these are all potentially good scores. A good score is just a score that's going to help you to get into your dream college. That's all it is. And so for some students, that'll be a 1090. For others, a 1360 or a 25 or a 31. But it's not about the number. These are just college admissions tests, and you really need to use them that way and do your research to some of the dream schools that you have in mind. And and see, what their incoming freshman class is scoring on these tests. Um, so while these tests are just one piece of the admissions puzzle, they do have bigger implications. So this chart just goes through a few schools that are commonly applied for. Um, and they give a sampling of where your scores can take you in addition to a strong application. So here we've got the 50th percentile, the middle 50th percentile for incoming students at each school. So 25% of incoming freshmen had test scores below the lowest number, and 25% had test scores above the highest number. So if you're inside the middle 50th here, then you have a score that gets students into that college. So it's really important to do this research ahead of time and, take a practice test to see how much distance there is between where you're scoring and where you want to be scoring so that you know how to prepare. So as much as you can use the PSAT for a launching pad for SAT or ACT prep, you want to do it with the right frame of mind, right? You need to know when you should take these tests, how long you'll need to prepare, and the first step is understanding the role that standardized tests play in college admissions, particularly these days. Um, so this survey comes from before COVID, but we're going to talk about how it's still important here. But back in 2019, we surveyed a bunch of college admissions counselors, and they told us, not we, the National Association of College Admissions Counseling, um, surveyed these counselors, and they asked them to rank the top factors for admitting first-time freshmen. Predictable if you think about what they need to consider when accepting students into their incoming class. Their grades in high school, their high school curriculum, of course. We also think of that as academic rigor. And number three would be testing. And so you may have heard somebody say that they care more about what you did over 4 years rather than over 4 hours on a Saturday. But they also really do want to see how you did on those 4 hours on a Saturday. So think about what an opportunity that is. You get a chance to prepare for those 4 hours. You could do a tremendous amount to improve your score and your chances at getting into a great college. Right? If you think about all the hours that you put into your high school GPA, it's a lot, right? For 4 years. But just a fraction of that, if you put into really preparing and practicing for one of these standardized tests, that could be a really strong asset to a very solid college application. It's a really fantastic opportunity for you to make a key element of your application stand out. Um, and so let's talk a little bit. One part of that survey, it asks institutions to rank their factors of admissions by importance. So 90% of colleges ranked GPA as considerably or moderately important. 85% say the same thing about high school curriculum, and 82% rank test scores as considerably or moderately important. So your high school transcript and your standardized test scores are the most important part of your college application. Very few students are going to get in on those two things alone, particularly at those highly competitive schools. But it's hard to get in anywhere if your GPA and your test scores aren't within a school's averages. You would need something really special to overcome both lower grades and lower test scores. Some things that are considered but maybe less important, those are going to be your essays and your writing samples, your recommendations, your class rank. Smaller institutions are more likely to rank some of those things as considerably or moderately important, but even those small schools are first going to look at your transcript and your test scores. So this is the way that you're going to make yourself competitive in the college admissions process. And so you may be wondering, what about test optional? A lot of schools have gone test optional. So we need to know what that means from the perspective of those admissions committees. The first thing is that a test optional process typically doesn't mean test prohibited or that a school won't consider test scores at all. There are a handful of test blind schools that won't consider a test score, but most will consider them if they're submitted. So unless you have something specifically labeled as test blind or test free, assume that any school that you're applying to will consider a test score if they're submitted. And at any of those test optional schools, a good test score is always going to make a better application. If you've got two students that have basically equal applications, but one's got a solid test score and the other one doesn't, the advantage goes to that student with the solid test score. You should also know that test optional doesn't mean the same thing everywhere. Some schools will require scores for certain majors, or if you're coming in with a lower GPA. There's also test flexible schools, so they might require some tests, but not the SAT or the ACT. So you want to make sure you do your research ahead of time. The other key thing to keep in mind about test optional policies is an application without test scores that makes everything else that much more important. So if your transcript isn't as impressive as your test score, you should test and submit your test score. And finally, if any school in your application list does require a test score, then you're not looking at a test optional application process. You are almost certainly going to have to take the SAT or the ACT. And so we're saying SAT and ACT together. There's a good reason for that. Every school, no matter what you've heard, if they accept standardized test scores, they don't care if it's the SAT or the ACT. They've got a big concordance chart that tells them what the equivalent score is on each test. So every school knows that a 1400 on the SAT is the same as a 31 on the ACT, et cetera, et cetera. But even more importantly, perhaps, schools will sometimes tie scholarships directly to your test scores. And so that's not just that schools will consider standardized test scores as part of their evaluation for merit aid, but that specific scholarships require specific SAT or ACT scores. So this is even true at some of those test optional schools. So even though you might see that a school seems like it's de-emphasizing test scores in the admissions process, it's possible that you'll still need a good score on the SAT or ACT to be considered for those merit scholarships. So it's never too early to start digging up this information and find out exactly what you're up against. And so I get one question really, really often here at the Princeton Review, which is, should I take the SAT or the ACT? And usually that comes from a student that's like, I'm a soccer player, I'm better at English than at math, and I want to study pre-law, something like that. Um, but I want to kind of pause there and say, no matter who you are, flip that question around and ask, why not try out both? And you might be thinking, because I don't want to do both. But taking both tests will actually strengthen your college applications. It'll give admissions officers more information about you and give you an opportunity to see which test you do like better. And so there's a lot of different ways to prepare for these tests. And now more than ever, right, you need to start early. There's a lot of unpredictability still about when students are able to take tests. So you want to have an advantage by having a plan that gives you time to react to any unexpected developments. So the first thing you need to do when you start to develop your testing plan is choose which test you'll prepare for first. It could be that you've taken the PSAT or a practice test and you find one more comfortable. But also, you want to consider scheduling here. So, the SAT and the ACT are offered at different dates and at different locations. So, you probably don't want to, choose to take it, on the morning after a big event, or if you'll be traveling, or if you have to go 2 hours away to get a seat. Consider what's convenient for you. um, as well as which test you think you might do better on. And choosing the right option kind of comes down to your needs as a student and what your overall goals are. So there's a lot of different ways to prep. You can get a prep book and go through something self-paced on your own, but a lot of students do find that they need a little more support. So you can either take a class or work with a tutor one-on-one. Right now, everything that we're doing here at the Princeton Review is online, so there's a huge variety of scheduling options available to everybody, no matter where you are. So let's say that you have registered for perhaps the SAT in June, and once you take your first test, you'll need to see, like, did I score where I wanted to? If so, then you're good. Perhaps you're done. But if not, if you or even if you just like to improve a little bit, you should register and prepare for another test date. And at this point, you should probably think about whether or not you want to switch tests. Um, if you really didn't do as well as you thought you would, it might be worth taking a look at the opposite test, and prepare for that quite a bit, and register for a second test as soon as you can feel ready to test again after the first one. And so you might have to go again after that, but hopefully, you've done enough preparation for the first or perhaps second time, and you're not going to be dedicating, more than 6 or 8 or 9 months to this whole process, right? That's not fun. Nobody wants to spend a year or two worried and registered and focused on standardized testing. So it's really good to just start thinking of a plan early before application deadlines are even on your horizon. So we're kind of wrapping up here on everything that I had wanted to cover. There's lots of time left over for questions. So if you have any of those, please feel free to type those into the chat. But I just want to kind of reflect on the fact that, if you're taking that PSAT next week, um, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but the score is not going to factor into your college admissions in any way, and you're probably not going to remember what that score was in a year or two. But you can use that experience of taking the PSAT to launch your prep for the SAT or the ACT. And just remember, it's a test of test taking skills. Primarily, it's just valuable as a really solid preview of what the SAT looks like. So you want to use your results to begin preparing for the SAT or the ACT. And once you know how to do that, you can begin developing your test prep timeline with plenty of time before those application deadlines start to creep up. So thank you all for coming. That's all I had. Again, I'm happy to hang by for questions. Oh, I see we've got someone typing here. But I just want to thank you guys for your attention and participation and wish you the best of luck, whether you're taking the PSAT on the 26th, or perhaps you are thinking, bigger about the SAT or the ACT, taking one of those maybe soon or later on this year. But if there's no questions, I think we will go ahead and call it. Just one is, oh, here we go, got one. Are the passages of the reading section easier than those on the SAT? No, the level of difficulty and the time per question, both of those things are the same on the SAT and ACT, or SAT and PSAT, excuse me. So the only difference really is that there's fewer questions overall on the PSAT, but the level of difficulty and the pacing that you have to do is exactly the same. Super good question. See, we've got another one coming in. No additional questions. All right, so we are all set. Thanks again, y'all. I hope you have a great day, great rest of your week, and good luck to those of you testing next week or in the future. Bye bye.